Tea. The world loves tea, but did you know wars have been fought over it? Long ago, tea was at the center of two very important events in world history. The first was the Boston Tea Party in 1773 in North America. The second was in China in the 19th century, the Opium Wars. The American Colonies. In the 18th century, many people from Britain went to live in the American colonies near present-day Boston. The colonies were owned by the British and ruled by the British king. However, the people who lived there, the colonists, did not want to be ruled by the British government. The tea tax. At that time, the British government put a costly tax on tea. Plus, they allowed only the British East India Company to import tea into the American colonies. The colonists were angry because of the tax. Some colonists stopped drinking tea altogether, and others bought tea on the black market from Holland. The colonists did not want to pay extra taxes to the British government. They protested, saying that the taxes violated their rights as British citizens. The colonists had no political power in Britain. The taxes had been passed by Parliament, not by their own colonial governments. In September of 1773, the East India Company sent ships loaded with tea to the American colonies. In New York and Philadelphia, the tea was sent back to England. In other ports, the tea was unloaded from the ships and left on the docks to rot. Tea into the sea. In Boston, the governor decided that the ships should be allowed to stay and unload. That night, about 60 colonists took action. These colonists called themselves the Sons of Liberty. They dressed up as American Indians, boarded the ships, and dumped the tea into the harbor. It was called the Boston Tea Party, and 340 chests of tea were dumped into the harbor that night. The war begins. The British were very angry and tried to strengthen their control over the colonies. However, the colonists started causing more trouble for the British, and soon the colonists and the British were at war. The war that led to independence. The American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, was a fight between Great Britain and the colonists. It was a long, hard, and costly fight. In 1776, the Americans declared themselves free with a Declaration of Independence. In the end, a peace treaty was signed, and the United States was born. The dangers of opium. In the 18th century, Britain controlled a lot of the world's land, population, and trade. But China was even more powerful. The British wanted to do business with China, but the Chinese were not interested. In the 19th century, however, things changed. Previously, opium had been a medicinal drug used in China. It was not much of a problem. But then people started smoking it. The drug was very addictive, and people died from it. Opium was expensive in China because it was imported from India and other places by the British. The British used the money from opium sales to buy expensive Chinese goods, such as porcelain, silk, and tea, to sell in Europe. The Chinese people learned of the harmful effects of smoking opium. The emperor made opium illegal. In 1839, the Chinese destroyed over 20,000 chests of opium owned by the British, which were stored on Chinese land. The Opium Wars. Fighting broke out months later. In 1840, British troops were sent to China. The British troops were very successful. By 1842, the fighting was over and a treaty was signed. As part of the peace deal, China agreed to pay a large sum in silver, open up 5 Chinese ports, and hand over Hong Kong to the British. A decade later, in 1856, the Second Opium War was started by the British. This time, the British had help from France. Again, the Chinese lost. They signed treaties with Great Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. These treaties were called the Unequal Treaties. They gave foreigners a lot of power in China, but the worst part was that the opium trade became legal in China. The link. The history of tea and opium is strongly linked. The British economy relied on taxes from tea. However, China only accepted silver as payment for its tea. This was bad business for the British East India Company. They could not afford to buy Chinese tea. For them, trading opium was much more profitable than paying in silver. Opium made tea affordable to Europe, but at what cost? Issues created by opium are still a problem today.